Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's webinar. We're very pleased to welcome Ben Whitehorn to speak to us this evening about Wheatley. Just to remind people, the next webinar will be in a fortnight, and it's going to be Chris Pickford talking about Made in St Neots, the history of the foundry in St Neots. For regular visitors, I'm sure the intro spiel will be quite familiar to you by now. But here we go anyway. Bear in mind that it's only the cameras and video microphones that are on mine and Ben's computer that will be active tonight. So do feel free to move around and make yourself comfortable without fear that you're disturbing anyone else. We would encourage people who are watching via Zoom to submit questions through the Q&A interface. You should be able to find that at the bottom of your screen. You might need to click through on three little buttons to find it if you're on a mobile device. But yes, do submit any questions that you've got through that interface, and we'll come to them at the end of the talk. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so if you've got any questions or technical issues, please do send them through to me. But for now, it just remains for me to welcome Ben onto the screen. So hopefully if I click a few buttons, he will magically appear.
Oh, have I magically appeared?
You have magically appeared, which is great.
Hey, it worked.
I would like to also congratulate Ben. He's going to attempt a live demo during today's webinar. So I'm sure we'll all have his fingers and everything else crossed.
Hopefully it won't become commiseration.
Well, exactly. So yeah, please do enter into the chat your feedback on how you think it's gone afterwards. But that's okay.
You're welcome to rate my ringing as well. Like no guarantees.
Well, that might link into a future talk that we do on Hawkeye. So anyway, I'll hand over to you, Ben, and I'll disappear off screen. So yeah, over to you.
Cool. Can I share? Does this? Okay, hold on. Let me share my screen. Okay. Is this visible?
Wonderful.
Yay.
Perfect.
Awesome. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. And so I'm going to talk this evening about Wheatley, and I'm sure quite a lot of the people who are here will already know what Wheatley is, what it does. And so I'm not going to spend very long talking about that. What I more want to give an idea of is kind of the story behind Wheatley, right? And a bit more about how Wheatley works, because those are the things you can't figure out very easily just by ringing with Wheatley, finding Wheatley on the internet. And a lot of the existing resources don't have much about this. So I figured that I may as well fill a blank, and hopefully this will make for an engaging talk. So yeah, without further ado, let's crack on into it. So before we start, obligatory thank yous. So first of all, a huge thank you to Matthew Johnson, who a lot of people see me as like the creator of Wheatley, which is like, that's not entirely untrue. I did a lot of the work for it, and it was kind of my idea in the first place. But Matt Johnson, who is also, he helped out a huge amount, and it can't be understated how much his impact like made Wheatley, like got Wheatley to where it is today, right? Because his experience in like software just like helped massively with ironing out my beginner mistakes and making Wheatley like an actually stable, usable thing, rather than just the experiment that it started out as. And of course, you can't do a talk in 2020 or 2021, right? After 2020, without thanking Bryn and Leyland in some way. So for my part, I'm thanking them obviously for creating Ringing Room in the first place. Like, what a great tool it is. And also for all of their help with like me asking questions about how Ringing Room works to like get Wheatley work and Ringing Room working, and all of their help and support with getting Wheatley to become part of Ringing Room, which is how I'm sure 90% of people will use it. And another name that I think probably very few people will have heard, they're not as famous as Bryn and Leyland, but I would like to thank Julian Parker, who back when I first released Wheatley as like, or we first released Wheatley, I should say, as like this experimental, very, very temperamental, very fragile thing. He was very supportive, and we had many long email conversations about ideas for how to improve it. He found many of the early obscure bugs that I never would have found otherwise. So he also deserves a mention. And lastly, to all of the community, people from the community who have come and contributed code or documentation fixes, that kind of thing. All of these people have contributed code directly or indirectly to Wheatley. And that's great. Like, it's great not to have Wheatley be entirely dependent on Matt and I. So yeah, thank you to all of these people. I won't read them out, you can see them in the thing. The people with the @ sign in front of them are people who I don't know what their real name is, so that's their GitHub username. I hope that's enough to that's what the ats are for. And on to tonight, thanks to David Richards for inviting me, and all of you for coming, and anyone who's watching this in the future on YouTube or wherever it gets put. Thanks for your support. The community reaction to Wheatley generally has been incredibly impressive. I can't thank people enough for that. So the plan, trademarked the plan. So what's going to happen this evening? Well, so the talk is going to have 3 parts. First part is what even is Wheatley, just so that everyone's up to speed. If you come here having never even heard of Ringing Room, like, what in a nutshell is Wheatley? Then second, a little bit about how Wheatley works at a very high level. This is not like, nitty gritty about like how all of the code, which variables do what, like how the code is structured, none of that. Like, this is just at a very like 1,000-foot bird's eye view of how Wheatley works and how to build a ringer, right? This is the how to build a ringer bit of the talk. And then third part, and this will probably take up most of the talk, is story time, which is the story of Wheatley and how it came to be where it is today. Because there's kind of, I don't know, there's a general misconception about how software is made, that kind of a lot of people see the end result and that's it, right? So you could go onto Ringing Room and there's like this pretty little box that says Wheatley, and you put in a method and assign Wheatley to some bells and it rings with you, or it has a tantrum and it doesn't. But hopefully that doesn't happen too often. And that kind of, like, all people see is the end result and the bugs that come with it, whatever. That's just reality of software development. But there's a kind of human story behind nearly all of these, right? There's someone like me, teenager, and well, I'm not a teenager anymore, but there's like some person who like rarely gets seen in the world of software, who's worked on it. Matt can't be here this evening, but he also, like, he gets heard about even less than I do, because I tend to publicize Wheatley a lot and answer the questions on Facebook that come up. Yeah, the main part of the talk will be a kind of story right back from like this time last year even, about how Wheatley came to be. So right, let's get into the talk proper. So what even is Wheatley? And there are kind of a few ways you could look at this question. On one level, well, let's try and answer this question, what even is Wheatley? Let's go to the place where the code is stored, and there's this neat description, which I'll cut out the guff. And according to that, Wheatley is a bot for Ringing Room that can ring any number of bells to increase the scope of practices. And I think that's quite a succinct, it's fairly incomplete as a description, but it's a fairly succinct way of getting to like the kernel of what Wheatley actually is. And for those who are unfamiliar with the term bot, I'm not sure how much it's used outside video games, but it's an autonomous, as the definition there says, it's an autonomous program on the internet or other network that can interact with systems or users. And it kind of has a connotation of not just interacting with users, but kind of pretending to be a user. So in this case, Wheatley pretends to be a ringer on Ringing Room. And the hope is that Wheatley will interact constructively with other ringers. That's the hope anyway. And on another level, you could look at what is Wheatley and go, and on that same website where the code is hosted, you can find the code. And obviously this is one answer to the question of what even is Wheatley, right? The code tree on the left actually is going to be this way for you, isn't it? So on the left, you've got the code tree with all the Python files for Wheatley. And on the right, we've got one of them open. I think that's bot.py, yeah. And the thing is, this is not a very useful answer either, because this is way too detailed. And like, in all honesty, like code is relatively boring. Like who apart from the people who care about what the code does, care about the code? Which brings me on to another thing, which is that there really aren't very many screenshots of Wheatley. And the ones that are look kind of like this, right? They're just some code open in a text editor. And that's not going to make for an engaging talk. So as a result, there won't be a huge number of pictures in the slides for this talk, but hopefully I'll make up for that with like just talking about the stuff, and hopefully the talk will still be good. But that's just a heads up that there won't be like loads and loads of pretty pictures. So the absolute, like the thing that sets Wheatley apart from other like existing bot ringers, right? Computer programs that try and pretend to be a human and ring potentially with other people, which is ultimately like computers are there to serve people, or like the point of a computer is to help people in some way, and the purpose of software is the same. So you are ultimately making a program to ring with other people. And like the design goal that sets Wheatley apart from everything else is this phrase, a ninja helper with no ego. So Wheatley is designed to be as close as possible to, you know, that like ideal practice night helper, right? That person who comes and they just like ring absolutely perfectly, but they don't have anything to prove. They're just like, oh, what do you want me to ring? And you put them on a bell and they just ring that line. Maybe they put a few people right, Wheatley can't, but your ideal practice night ninja helper would. And they have no ego, so they're not going to like take control of the ringing, like expect people to keep up with them. They're just going to try their best to fit into what everyone else does. And that was what I found was kind of missing with existing things. And to be fair, I haven't used most of them, so this might be wrong, or my information might be out of date. But this was the goal of Wheatley, and like the benchmark that Matt and I set ourselves. And so the real answer to the question, what even is Wheatley, is like, well, the easiest way to answer that is to do a demo. So fingers crossed this is going to work. The demo effect being what it is, it's entirely possible that this will just not work. And this is also like, this can be viewed as how do I get Wheatley to work as well? Because I know a lot of people ask that. And I'll get onto that. I'll touch on that again later in the talk. So we can go to Ringing Room, and I'll just create a new tower. Let's call it like Wheatley Talk for simplicity. And you'll notice that when you create a new tower, Wheatley is not there. And that's because Wheatley, you have to opt into having Wheatley, because I don't know, I wanted Wheatley to be enabled by default, but Brendan Leyland didn't. And it's fair, it is the right thing to do. So in order to get that, you need to get to in order to enable Wheatley, you have to get to the tower settings somewhere. And you can only do this if you own the tower. And in this case, I do own this tower because I made it. So we can hop into settings, and down here, there's a switch, enable Wheatley. And we tick this, and it switches to yes, magic. And there's some stuff about how Wheatley works, what Wheatley is. But now we can go to the tower, and magically we have a box for Wheatley with all the settings you could possibly need. And we have a magic user called Wheatley who will just permanently be there. They'll never leave the tower until you switch that switch off. But they won't do any harm to the tower by being there. So I'm going to attempt a demo here. Hope, fingers crossed, Wheatley will behave. The demo effect being what it is. Maybe they won't. So I don't know. For brevity, let's ring plain hunt major. So pick a method to ring. I'd like to ring plain hunt major. Peel speed seems okay. We can ring up, down, in, and stop at rounds just for the sake of like, that's easiest. So these two should be on for like handbell ringing basically. And in fact, I'll just switch to handbell ringing. And I don't know, I'll ring 5, 6, and I'll just fill in the rest for Wheatley. So now we've got 6 Wheatleys and me. And Wheatley should behave every bit like a human ringer in this regard. Except that obviously Wheatley isn't going to spy on your like Zoom call or whatever you're using to do the voice calls. So in order to actually make Wheatley work, you have to call Bob in there. Hold on, is my, that is a point. Is my audio working?
Yes, I certainly heard Bob at that moment.
Awesome. Cool. In which case we can crack on. I just thought, you know, like now isn't a good time to check whether the audio is working before I get all the way through the demo and you just couldn't hear anything. So I'll assume that everything's working. So if everything goes according to plan, which it should, then when I press look to, Wheatley will just start ringing and we'll ring 2 rounds and then go into plain hunt on 8. And whether or not this is like me derping and holding up, there's an important thing about like the whole ringing around other people, which is that Wheatley will hold up for you if you think. I'll try and do that intentionally, or at least I'll say it's intentional, even if it's not.
Look to.
So
Troubles going and gone.
So now Wheatley will hold up over me. And we get round, so Wheatley will stop. There we go. And Wheatley will behave properly. Like if you call a Bob. Wheatley will detect whatever Bob is appropriate. So in Grancer and Stedman, it will be different to, you know, bringing plain Bob or whatever. And single as well.
Single.
Like all of the calls should just work out of the box. So that was, I think, a successful demo. All things considering, and we're 20 minutes in, so I probably need to keep moving. So next part of the talk, how does Wheatley work? And this is a very, very high level view. I'm not going to go into details of the code, but just a very high level, how do the nuts and bolts, like if you had to create a computer ringer, like what overall parts would you need and how should they be structured is the point of this. So you can kind of introspectively think about what a human ringer needs, right, in order to ring. And there are 3 fundamental pieces. And I'd like to say that these are like some very deep truth that Matt and I stumbled upon after months and months of iteration, and we're like, oh yeah, this is like the best thing. But in reality, I looked back through the code in order to do this talk, like right back to when it started. nearly a year ago. And this structure has been in the code right since the beginning. So this is a fairly there seems to be a fairly canonical way of structuring something like this. So there are 3 parts, right? The first one is, well, you need some way to interact with other people, right? A ringer that just like exists silently in its own box, right? Like that won't even work. So you need something. In a human, this is kind of like the eyes, like arms and ears kind of thing, right? You need to register when other people are ringing and when the conductor calls stuff, and you need to be able to ring your bell or bells in Wheatley's case, at the right times, and potentially make calls as well, which Wheatley can do. And then the second bit you need some kind of knowledge of what exactly is being rung, right? Because you can't just have, you could ring rounds, I guess, with just a simple loop of like ring the lightest bell and then go down, and then put a gap in every other stroke to make people happy. But that wouldn't be very interesting. You want to maybe potentially even ring a court appeal or appeal with Wheatley, which people have done. I'm hugely impressed. Well done. And like that was a cool moment when the first court appeal got run. So you need some kind of concept of what is being run. And then you need some concept of rhythm. And I couldn't really find a thing that's better than this. So we have just like musical rhythm. And this is like the where do I ring? Because you can think of like these things as answering like how, what, and where, or when, in the case of rhythm. So the thing on the left, the rope is kind of representing how do I ring, right? How do I ring and how do I hear other people ringing? Then the road, like the blue line thing, like the understanding of methods is like, well, what do I ring? What order do the bells go in? And then the rhythm part is combining like the knowledge from the first 2, like hearing people ring and knowing what order the bells are supposed to come in, combine those and figure out where should I ring, or when should I ring even. And in the code, I couldn't think of better names than these, so I'm just going to use the names where they are in the code. This bit is called tower.py. The .py says it's a Python file. So this was called like the tower because it's the way you interact with a ringer in tower. And this was there's a whole folder for the code files that deal with row generation, and that's essentially it. They generate rows and they consume. They kind of consume events as well. So it's like, oh, someone called Bob, like that obviously affects the rows that are going to be generated. So the row generation handles that as well. And the rhythm, obviously, like that's handled in something in the directory called rhythm. And there are a load of other things. There's a fairly complicated system behind that I won't get into because this is just meant to be a high level overview. But there's a problem. We can't just make separate pieces, right? That like no one, that's not useful. That's like this. This is like buying a Lego set and opening all of the plastic bags, tipping them out on the table and saying, oh yes, I built a Lego model, right? You haven't. You've got all of the pieces. Like you're some step along the way, but we're not done. And the answer to this is bot.py. And this is a piece of the code that's called a singleton in computer science. It means that there's only going to be one of these created ever. And the bot handles like, it basically takes those 3 disparate pieces and glues them together or sticks the Lego bricks together in such a way that you get a constructive, like you get something that can ring essentially, rather than just like 3 separate pieces that exist on their own. And this handles like all of the stuff in real time. So it kind of binds, oh, whenever there's a call, like if someone calls Bob, or like the tower says that Bob was called, then I need to tell the row generation that happened so that it can potentially update and Wheatley will respond to the Bob accordingly. And the same, you have like when someone rings, you tell the rhythm that happened so that it can update its concept of like how fast people are ringing and stuff. And this is all very well, but we're still not done. We still have another piece to fit in the puzzle. And that is the main function, which is something that goes from the code just being like something on disk, like it's a load of text files. We need to somehow ask the user what they want to ring and go from that to some state where Wheatley can actually ring. And that's like that. There's quite a lot of code in that actually. And that handles like initialization. It sets everything up. It reads the arguments, or it reads that box in ringing room. Essentially, it figures out what those settings are supposed to be, puts everything together, glues it all, and then passes control over to the bot, which then takes everything from there. And control is never returned to main. Main is just there to get everything set up. And that happens every time Wheatley is run. So if we put all this in a pretty diagram, we start off with the main function, which then creates bot.py, and this talks to each one of the three things in turn. But an important bit of software design is that if there's a possibility that you can split the code up into separate pieces that never talk to each other, then that's a good thing. Because the problem is like the number of different connections you can have between some chunks of code is hugely more than the number of chunks. Like in the case of three, it's fine, three things, three connections, but you get up to like, I don't know, it's basically the square of the number of components. So you want to minimize the number of interactions, because that's like a large step of how difficult the code is to understand. That's really a bit of a computer science rabbit hole. But anyway, we have this kind of tree of like main creates bot, which talks individually to all of them and makes sure that all of these pieces can come together to form Wheatley as we know it. So hopefully that's kind of how Wheatley works and what Wheatley does. Hopefully I've done an adequate job of explaining that. And now we get onto the bit that I think you're probably here for, which is the story time. And of course, like no talk would be complete without a kind of a bit about me section. And I don't want to put it that at the start, because I don't know, you're all here to hear about Wheatley, not me. I'm just the person who made it. So before, like this is the story, I guess, starts with me, I guess, because I made it. So before Wheatley, hey, come on, Google. Oh, okay. Looks like all of this wants to load at the same time. Oh, well. So I wanted these to load in one by one, but apparently they haven't. So I was born in Munich in 2000, and I'm sure people are already doing the maths. And I had a birthday this year, so I'm 21. And I've been programming since I was about 11. And I mean programming in the most general sense of like, I type some code and a computer runs it. The code I made when I was 11, I still have some of it. And it's interesting, shall we say. And I started ringing about 6 years ago, almost to the day. I think it's maybe 6 years plus or minus a month. And currently I'm studying computer science at St. Anne's College in Oxford. And so like studying computer science makes a huge difference to how good Wheatley is, I think. It's not to say that like self-taught programming, like teaching yourself programming is not, it's by no means impossible, right? But yeah. And now for the real story, like the bit that actually involves everyone and the story about Wheatley, shall we say. So I guess any story that ever happens like around this time starts with this. And I'm sure you all know what it is. I'm sure you've seen this picture more than enough over the last year and a bit. And this is what I would call Attack of the COVID Monster. And this is 23rd of March, the big date that I'm sure everyone will remember forever. And yeah, basically everything stopped. You know what's happened. Unless you've been living under an extremely big rock, you know what happened. Everything got cancelled. And along with that, so did my plans for the summer. And that's a bit of a problem because the summer holidays in Oxford are very long, like they're 16 weeks. And 16-week holidays are long with lots of O's. And they're even longer because rigging was cancelled, right? So all of the things that I would be filling my 16 weeks with have suddenly disappeared. And this is extremely evident. If we look at the graph of contributions I've made on like the main code hosting website called GitHub. Each blob circle here is a day with months going along the top. And basically the lighter the green blob is, the more contributions I made to anything on that day. And you can really clearly see where my summer holiday started, right? Because basically nothing was happening. I would make a few contributions here and there, and then suddenly, boom, around here, I think this is the 11th of June, just from like what the rest of the slides say. And boom, suddenly my holiday starts at around here. And I'm like, hold on, this is really boring. Like, I'm not going to survive 16 weeks of this. So I suddenly start like making contributions galore. And this is mainly like, I think we can kind of fit this into like, this is Wheatley. And then this is, I think, a different project that was still like basically boredom repellent.
Sadly, we can't see your mouse pointer at this moment.
Oh, so, can't you? Okay.
You'll have to, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I think we get the rough gist of, yeah.
Okay, in which case I'll stop pointing at things. That's very good to know. So 11th of June, like the story basically starts on the 11th of June, and Matt and I created a project. This was after a university society practice. I was like, oh, ringing room is a thing. You know what would be cool? And that's creating a computer ringer. And I had no idea what I was letting myself into. I was very naive. And I was like, let's start this little experiment, see what we can do. And so I take this as like Wheatley was being born, right? Essentially, although maybe conceived is a better term. And like I went back through the history. This is quite a lot of stuff, but the important thing is like, initial commit, add code for the first time. This is like the first 2 snapshots of Wheatley's code history. So it goes all the way back to 11th of June. I think the idea started a little bit before that, but I don't have any records. And back to the whole like code doesn't make an interesting presentation. This was the best I could find. And then a little bit later after that, we just like chipped away at it, and it became clear that this might actually be useful. This like crazy experiment that we've made might actually be useful to people. And before we released it, I wanted to give it a name, because RR bot, like, it's quite short, I'll admit, but it's not very, like, it doesn't stick in people's memory. And it's also not very descriptive. Like, it doesn't set this project apart from anything else. And so we've got this. This is a screenshot of, there'll be a few of these. These are like, every time big code changes happen, there's what's called a pull request, and they have a little number that will just steadily go up as the project goes on, and a description. And this is like what happened, and we can see like how many different code changes there were, how many files changed, blah, blah. That's not super important. But what is important is that this was on the 27th of June. Wait, you can't see my mouse, I remember. 27th of July, and this is 1 month into the project. So this is quite a while. There's a kind of takeaway here, which is that nothing ever happens very quickly. It's kind of, a lot of people go into projects, like I went into the project of Wheatley being like, oh yeah, like I'll start this thing and quickly it will be done. How wrong I was. But that's just something to take away. If you're working on your own project, which like I absolutely recommend, it's great fun. Like, don't expect things to happen straight away. And so we needed a name, and I spent a long time talking to friends trying to figure out a name. And eventually we settled on the name Wheatley. And this is probably the single most asked question I've had, which is, where does the name Wheatley come from? And it comes from a video game. It's named after a character. And it's this character that just appeared on screen. It's a little one-eyed robot. And it comes from the video game Portal 2, which is a fantastic game. And Wheatley, like the character of Wheatley, is basically there for comedy, really. There's another character called GLaDOS who's very slow. She's the main antagonist of the whole game. Very slow, thoughtful speaking. And Wheatley is just like all over the place. He's voiced by Stephen Merchant, who does a fantastic job. And I was like, yes, Wheatley it is. And Wheatley, the name Wheatley was free on the like code repository index. So like there's a central place where you can put packages of Python code, and it's a heck of a lot easier to install things if you can get your code onto that platform, right? Because it's centralized. And Wheatley was free. The name Wheatley was free, so we could take it. And this is entirely Craig Robertson's idea. Shout out to him. He's the best person to go to if you need names for anything. And so he should take credit for this idea. So now Wheatley is called Wheatley, and that's great, but still no one knows about it, right? And so what's this? This is like a week later after that. I put a post up on Facebook, and yeah, I do an excellent job of selling what Wheatley was to become, but wasn't at the time, which was possibly a mistake. But you know, you can't oversell something really. And this post got quite a lot of attention. It got like around about 30 likes, 2 heart reacts. I would count them as likes, but I guess they're worth more and should be split up. And 85 comments. Like even months after I posted this, people were still commenting. And there was basically a 50-50 split at this point between people who were like, oh, I've used it and this is great, and people who were like, oh, hold on, this is great, but it needs like a command line and I need to install Python. What? Like, how do I even do this? So it was basically a 50-50 split of people who'd got it to work and were like, oh, this is cool. Like it has some rough edges, but it's still cool. And people who were like, how do I even get this to work? And at this point, it was like this post, you can maybe read it if you pause the video or have been reading the slide. But basically the upshot is going back to the design decision that we had at the start. The main design focus is that Wheatley should always work around humans, not vice versa, right? So if there's ever a possibility where humans do something weird or not exactly logical, then it's Wheatley's job to fit around human behavior, not the other way around. Which is why Wheatley is incredibly lenient about stuff like when calls are supposed to be called. Like basically, you can call calls almost on the row that they happen, and Wheatley is fine with it. Stuff like that. And people calling rounds in funny places has tripped a lot of people up recently, but that's now fixed. So this is all very well, but it was clear that Wheatley's potential was kind of mostly limited by the fact that it started out as an experiment, and Matt and I are both programmers, so we're quite happy with a command line interface, like how Windows used to work in the 80s or 90s, or DOS, as it was known before Windows was a thing. And we were quite happy with this, but it became abundantly clear as soon as that happened that this was not going to be useful. And so about a month after that post, I started work on the Reading Room version, which is, I'm sure, what people will recognize Wheatley as today. So on the left, I guess this is left for you guys. On the left, we have like the first screenshot I can find of the box, and you can see it has most of the main features of the Wheatley box today, but with a few extra things. Like the sensitivity thing turned out not to be useful, so I removed it. And the debug settings, that was just for debugging the code, and that was removed later as well. And then the middle screenshot is me testing the method box. Kudos to Bob Wallace, by the way, because Bob Wallace's Blue Line website is, one, it's the gold standard for Blue Line websites, as far as I'm concerned, and two, its search functionality, like the way it sorts methods when you search is fantastic, and it just gives you what you want without much hassle. And you can see here, it's like you type CAM, this is in an 8-bell tower, and it's immediately suggested Cambridge. So it's like, there's no other method that people usually ring. And so I talked a bit about to Bob Wallace, and he very graciously said, oh yeah, you're very welcome to just ping his server with requests whenever anyone types into the box to use his search. And so the methods are kept up to date. That's great. And he added filtering by what stage it is so that Wheatley could give better search results. And then finally, on the right, we have what it looks like today. And this is a screenshot I took about a week ago when I was making these slides. And that's cool. This is 8th of September. And this is I'm still in my summer holidays at this point. So I have loads of time. And I don't have a job as well. I'm a student. So I worked basically continuously at this for about a month, because 8th of September to 3rd of October, basically a month between starting and this being merged. Merged means I suggested some changes to Ringing Room, and I can't make changes because I don't own the code. And in this case, Bryn decided the changes were up to scratch and merged them into the main code. But disaster strikes. And this is, so about 2 weeks after this, Bryn and Leyland get the development server up and running. There's like a testing server that isn't connected to the main one where all of these new features get tested. And people have a play around, and some weird stuff happened, but you know, like there will always be bugs when you release things. That's just reality. But there's a problem, which is that pretty much Wheatley did what I think is the closest I've ever seen to taking over the world, which is that, to quote Leyland, the dev server is nearly unusable now. And basically this was because somehow Wheatley kept duplicating himself. So you would end up with like more and more and more and more. I think there are about like 90 or 100 odd Wheatleys running all at the same time. And this would basically cripple the server. So it would become slower and slower and slower until it was unusable. And so the upshot is, the second quote is, I'm going to pull the server down and disable Wheatley. And this was like kind of a pain, because this is not good, right? And there's clearly something wrong here. But the thing is, getting two completely different code bases to work together properly is really, really difficult. And somewhere I'd made a mistake. And I just couldn't really face it. And I just stopped working on the project really for about 3 months. And the lesson learned from this is that really that burnout is a real thing. It's very easy to dismiss it when you start a project and be like, this project is so cool, I'll always want to work on it. And you can like throw your life into a project, and that's great, but you need to do it in moderation. Like don't single-mindedly go towards something, because eventually you'll burn out. And this is the first time like in my life really that I encountered burnout, and it is a real thing. Just like be careful about it is my lesson from this. Anyway, like, you know the story that must happen, because Wheatley is a thing in Ringing Room. And so about 3 months after that, I started work again. And about halfway through January this year, the second lot of changes to Ringing Room were merged. And then, and these seemed to work, right? It was great. They were much more stable. They weren't perfect, but it's fine. We can do tweaks later. They were definitely good enough to work. And they weren't crashing everything left, right, and center, which is what we want. And then about a month after that, it went through beta testing for several weeks, and then there was a beta testing practice. And to Wheatley's credit, or maybe to Matt and I's credit, Wheatley performed admirably. I don't have a screenshot for this. I think people would have objected to me making a screenshot. But this is, and I kind of note here, like we're 8 months into the project now. This is not like Wheatley suddenly appeared out of nowhere. This was a very long and relatively slow process of just like slowly improving. And here we come, finally released. And this is an unbelievable coincidence, right? Like 9 months and 1 day, like what also takes about 9 months, right? A baby going a pregnancy, right? So it's almost like Wheatley was conceived in the summer and then 9 months later was born, right? So that's the kind of time scale that it takes to get something off the ground. Like maybe it would have been faster if I'd had more time and hadn't gone to uni. But burnout being a thing, I probably would have been unable to manage my time correctly to not burn out and take a break. But 12th of March, big day, we get to where we are today, which is that Wheatley is a box and Ringing Room. And this was just a huge boon. Like immediately after this was released, the usership massively increased. And this is great. Like this is kind of what Wheatley should have been the whole time. Like I've learned a lot about usability and what people expect from software, like average people, not just like me as a software developer. Like there's a big gap, and it matters. It really matters how easy your software is to use. Is the kind of lesson I've learned from this, and hopefully other people making stuff, like if you hear this, then that's a takeaway. Because as developers, we're not like we're very accepting of clunky software, perhaps. Hello. Yeah. Let me move. So that brings us to today, 6th of May, and this is 10 months and 25 days into the project. So in maybe 2 months' time, 25 days, that's 1 month's time. So in about a month, Wheatley will be a year old. And that kind of gives an idea of how long it takes to get a project like this off the ground. Obviously, it wasn't 10 or 11 months of absolute work. But it was still like Matt and I were chipping away at this for a very long time, and other people in the community more recently. So what does the future hold? Well, I think at this point, Wheatley is essentially feature complete. Like there aren't any really big features that Wheatley's missing now. So all of the major design goals are not necessarily perfectly fulfilled, but they're good enough to be slowly improved on over time. There are none of them where you can be obviously like, oh, Wheatley clearly fails one of the design goals. I think that's basically a thing. But the ringing room version is quite behind on features, right? Namely, being able to ring compositions and have Wheatley call them is like probably the single most requested feature I have. And so basically we're just down to small tweaks at this point. Will be like slow improvement. I suspect most of the changes will come from the community, not Matt and I at this point. And that's the last point, actually. I keep forgetting what the slides are. I can't look ahead. So this is all a bit of a surprise for me. So yeah, I'm really happy with how far Wheatley has gone. It's great, like all of the things that people are doing with Wheatley that I never would have predicted. Like I would never really have rung a court appeal with Wheatley. Like I don't use Wheatley very much myself, partly because I don't have much need for Wheatley, and also I don't really like using my own software. It's a bit weird. I tend to see the things that aren't quite there yet, and I don't tend to use my own stuff. But it's yeah, the community support generally, like on all levels, like the support from like people thanking me and like saying how much they've used it, to people contributing to the code, to people wanting me to come and talk about it even, right? Like the support has been incredible, and I couldn't thank people enough for that. And even the people who've like given me bug reports, like that's like, if all I hear is bug reports, then obviously it's like a bit soul destroying, right? But that's absolutely not been the case. Like in moderation, like people, like I need to know what problems people are having, because otherwise I won't know and I won't be able to fix it. So thanks to everyone who's done that as well. So I think that brings the talk to a close. So thanks very much for coming. And I believe this now goes to questions. I hope I haven't overrun by too much. I had no idea how long the talk was going to be beforehand. So yeah, hope you all enjoyed, and question time.
Cool. Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really good. And yeah, don't worry about timing. Yeah, I'm not a particular stickler for it. So yeah, if you do have any questions, put them into the Q&A. I think I'd like to kick off with a boring question, the best kind of question, which is obviously there are a lot of work or project management philosophies that people could overlay on projects like this. So things like specifications and design goals and definitions of minimum viable products. So that's all up in the sort of how do you work out what the features are, and then obviously there's lots of exciting stuff, and some of it's supported on GitHub in terms of boards and so working out where you are relative to your goals, and and refresh cycles to work out where whether you're going in the right direction or whether you need to change the goals in order to address the ultimate need. Did you do any of that, or is it a little bit more more organic?
I mean, there's a quite a short answer, which is no. Basically, we experimented a bit. Obviously, we do have a list somewhere of like all of the things that we want to do. We have like features and bug reports are all in one place. They're called issues in GitHub. So we have a big list of those, which is like a kind of tracker of like how the project's going and where it's intended to go in the future. But for a project like Wheatley, we didn't really have a need for something like that. That like having design goals, like it's absolutely useful for some projects, right? I'm not saying that it's never a thing that you should do, but it comes into its own when you have lots and lots of people working on a project, and you need to make sure that you don't just have utter chaos. Like you need something like a director in a film that makes all of the actors and artists, whatever, come together and produce something that like actually feels coherent. And for us, we're two people who have the same goal, really. And like we know that we have the same goal. And if there ever came down to an argument, like it was kind of my project, and I have like the exact vision of what I want it to be, which obviously it isn't yet. It will never be, but I know kind of what we're aiming at. So it was always like people could ask me what I thought, which kind of sounds a bit egotistical, but like every project needs some kind of single focus, right? Which I think is what the whole design goals thing is. I should write up a list of those so that when other people come and contribute, like we can say like what is a good feature and what is a bad feature, because like obviously not every change is useful, and it's a bit difficult if there's no like if that's never written down, then someone just coming to the code has no idea. But yeah, we didn't use it. We experimented with the boards, but they just they took up more time. Like considering this is a passion project, like the single most valuable thing to the project is our enthusiasm, like the enthusiasm of the people working on it. And anything that directs that enthusiasm away from the code or like away from the progress of the project itself is kind of a detraction, right? So we decided that it wasn't like the project was clearly doing okay without a kind of bigger structure over it. So we're just like, let's keep working, improving things. And it's fundamentally a relatively small project, right? It's not super complicated. So yeah, that's the very long answer that means no, basically.
Good question. And actually, you mentioned a good point. People often get sort of sidetracked by metrics, but roughly how many lines of code are in there? Roughly?
Oh, I counted this recently. It's about 2,500 lines of actual code, like not blanks. It's about 3,000 or 4,000, including comments and blanks. But of actual nitty-gritty code that does stuff, it's about 2,500. And I think that's basically a peak at this point. There might be a little bit of increase, but I don't expect it to really go above 3,000 kind of. It's just not that complicated. And there's not a whole load of new features we could add.
Yeah. And I think just to go to the other point that you kind of mentioned, but I think it's really important to emphasize that I think one of the great things about both Ringing Room and Wheatley is that they're both on these public platforms, so people can look and they can have a play and they can see if they first of all they can try the talk implied that Wheatley, the tip of Wheatley is a little bit further ahead than is currently released on Ringing Room. Is that right?
Yeah, so, there are several features that aren't out yet. So
yeah, so people can try them if they're interested, and I think that's really great. And so and even if you're not the kind of person who would try running that, like you say, the issue lists are open. So if you've got this great idea and you're like, I just don't know how to communicate this, that's one option. But perhaps you'd like to say something about the sort of live coding sessions you've done.
Oh yes, I forgot to cheekily plug those. So yeah, I was like, I kind of alongside this in terms of like opening up, like kind of shedding a light behind the scenes kind of how stuff works. I've been doing live coding sessions, which are kind of like these webinars, except that I live stream on YouTube and there's a text chat that everyone can put into, and I read it in real time. People can reply to stuff. and chat about things. And it's basically like, normally it's me writing code, but in reality, like it doesn't bear that much resemblance to be sitting by myself writing code, because I explain things. I have like a whiteboard and stuff, and I draw diagrams, and that's like, I just kind of talk through what it's like and what I kind of think about when I'm doing it. And people get to see behind the scenes. They get to ask questions about like, oh, why actually is it like this? And I have had several ideas that people have come to me on stream and been like, oh, you could do this. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm usually like fairly skeptical of new ideas. And then I'm like, actually, hold on. That's actually just way better than the way we're doing it right now, right? Like, and just like sometimes the new perspective is what you need to see something differently and be like, this is an idea for how it could be different. So yeah, and that's another thing about like being open source. It's not just that people can come and see it, people can contribute. Like people with the skills like can make changes to the code, and not like they can't always be merged. It's not like there's utter carnage and people are contributing, tweaking the code left, right, and center, right? But loads of the new features weren't implemented by Matt and I, right? And every single user benefits from that, not just the people who've contributed code. It is a very nice, like it's just a much more open way than just like having someone with like maybe an email address at the bottom of the website that's like, if you want to change, have feature suggestions, email me, and I may or may not respond. Like I may or may not even get around to your feature or whatever. Like worst case, like you suggest a feature and we're like, oh, this is a good feature, but we don't have time. And then you can fork the code, make some changes, and then submit a pull request. We'll probably review it and go, oh yeah, like there's a better way of doing this, whatever. A few rounds of review, code will get merged and the feature's there. And it's like, basically anyone can do that with like fairly basic tech skills. It will take some time, but it's not super arduous. And I just like it when people come and contribute. It's really nice to see someone who likes the project enough to like put stuff back into it themselves, right?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, hello. Well, I don't think there's any questions open, so I think it just remains to say thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been absolutely brilliant, really, really interesting to look at the history and go through like you say, the first year of
yeah,
and it'd be really interesting to see what becomes, and not least because I think obviously during the sequence of these webinars we've come across people who've adapted to remote ringing, and it's got some potential advantages even when we can return to tower. So I'm really interested to see what happens, certainly for this year, when ringing's still a little bit uncertain, but then
fingers crossed.
yeah, what happens in the future, because like you say, actually having now a free platform which knows every method that you might ever want to ring, and like you say, especially with the composition feature coming along, that's a really powerful tool which deserves to stay around for a while.
I mean, yeah, I hope the tail is very long. I hope.
Yeah.
Both for Wheatley and Ringing Room, right? Yeah. I think for a long time. I hope it will continue even when we can actually ring. Because I mean, it also brought people together. Like I regularly ring with people from like the US, not so much Australia because the time zones are just like completely infeasible. But like I would never have met half the ringers I know. Not maybe not half, but a significant number of the ringers I've met because they were at a ringing room practice and they're in a completely different part of the country. Would never have met them otherwise. But you can do this kind of thing online, which you can't do in person. So yeah, I do hope there's a long future for both of the programs.
Cool. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great.
Very cool.
So just say good night, and hope to see people at the next webinar, which is going to be, like I say, 2 weeks time, and it's made in St Neots. Right. There we are.